Greetings, citizens. Hey you beautiful, creepy human being you, and welcome to today's true crime episode. I am so happy that you are here. I am so happy that somehow in all of this that we're forced to deal with on the day-to-day, today you and I were able to find each other on this crazy little planet that we call home. My name's Brittany or Bratterstein, whichever you prefer, and today we're going to be discussing the murders of LeAnn Emry, Jennifer Marcum, Kaysi McLeod, and Terry Kimball at the hands of a police informant turned serial killer. But before we get started, if you have not yet had the pleasure, please make sure to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing that bell. I put out a new video every single week, sometimes 2 a week, and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you specifically you, but I can only do that if you join the Brat Pack and become one of us. Now, before we get into all the details of today's case, I first need to say a big thank you to the sponsor of today's video, and that is ZocDoc. Because if there's one thing I've learned over my many years on this planet, it's that your health really is the most valuable thing that you have. Things can change so fast, sometimes overnight, and you would not know what was going on within you if you weren't on top of it. And I've just learned how important it is to look out for yourself, to stay proactive, and to, feel comfortable with the type of care that you are getting. Because, if you're not comfortable, you're not going to want to go to the doctors, right? And this is something that ZocDoc can really help with. ZocDoc is a free website that lets you find and book doctors of many different types, pretty much any condition that you can think of, from mental health to dental health, which are two things that are very, very important. We're talking about in-network appointments with more than 100,000 healthcare providers across nearly every specialty, from eye care to skin care to so much more. And these doctors are verified by actual patients, they take your insurance, and most importantly, they're actually available when you need them. And best of all, it's super easy. You can use the website to filter through doctors that fit your criteria and book your appointment through the site. So you don't have to deal with any of that phone call anxiety that I know that some of us, though we are adults, still have. And by some of us, I mean me, specifically me. Maybe you too, but definitely me. And you know what? Not only is booking through ZocDoc super easy, it's super fast too, because the typical turnaround time for an appointment is 24 to 72 hours, but sometimes they even have same-day appointments. When I was pregnant, it really just opened my eyes to how important it is to take care of yourself and be comfortable. Again, be comfortable with the care you're getting, because comfortability, convenience, and reliability weren't words that previously I associated with healthcare, but with ZocDoc, you really can. So if all of this sounds good to you as it does to me, and you would like to try ZocDoc out for yourself, make sure to click the link in my description box. It's ZocDoc.com/Bratterstein to find and book a top-rated doctor today. And now I just want to say a big thank you to ZocDoc for partnering with me on today's video. It's partners like ZocDoc that make it possible for me to put out videos as consistently as I do. And a big thank you to you guys for always being so supportive of all of my sponsors. You rock, don't ever change. All right, let's go ahead and get into this video. So this video is on a case that was recommended to me by a member of the Brat Pack named Angela. Hi, Angela. Thank you, Angela. And you may have noticed, or maybe you haven't, but I don't typically do a lot of serial killer cases on my channel. I find them to be incredibly daunting to look into and to structure, because I tend to go down a lot of different rabbit holes in a serial killer case. There are many rabbit holes to go down. Hop, little bunny, hop, hop, hop. But with this particular case, I just found myself really wanting to talk about it after I started to look into it, because it's the kind of case that I feel like, one, isn't talked about a lot. I had never heard of this guy before, and it's a case that I don't believe was taken seriously enough, in my opinion, in the beginning, because one, the guy responsible was a police informant, so maybe the police didn't really want to look at one of their own informants too closely. Maybe that's the case. And also, he chose victims that were not perfect, right? And the thing about that is that nobody's perfect, so them not being perfect doesn't make their murders and what happened to them any less tragic and any less worth solving. You know what I mean? So with that, today I'm going to tell you the entire story. I read all the things so that you do not have to. And at the end of this video, I want you to answer the question of the day. Actually, I have two. And these are them. They are coming right now. 1, do you think that there are additional victims linked to this particular serial killer? And 2, do you think it's possible that he was part of an organized crime ring and that more people than just him were involved in these murders? Let me know all your thoughts in the comments below after we go through the details of this case. And now, with all of that said, come gather around and let me tell you the story of the murders of LeAnn Emry, Jennifer Marcum, Kaysi McLeod, and Terry Kimball. Okay, I have been sitting here way too long trying to figure out exactly where to start with this case because there is so much to discuss. And I'm trying to figure out how best to format the information to make it as digestible as possible. But I think the best place to begin would be early 2006. It was around this time that a detective named Gary Thatcher was investigating a bank fraud case. Basically, the bank had contacted the authorities saying that somebody's account was getting basically drained. They were writing bad checks and they were just taking money out of the account. Like, I believe it came to a total of $83,000 that was removed from this account. And there were checks written from this account that totaled $55,000. So this was like a large sum of money to go missing and very serious, which is why, a detective was assigned to it and they were putting in the work and getting down to business. Now, police were able to quickly link the bad checks and the stolen money and the fraudulent activity when it came to this account to a man named Scott Kimball. And that's because he was writing these checks to a business that he and his wife shared on a farm. So police go to this farm, and when they get there, Scott Kimball is not there, but his wife, Lori, is. And they don't know this at the time, but he was actually on the run. He took off to California. And it turns out that his wife, Lori, didn't even know that's where he was. It wasn't weird that he was gone because apparently he was known to just go away for long periods of time and not always be in the most communication with her. It was something that was normal for their relationship. He would just dip sometimes. So it wasn't weird that he was gone. But there was a Shyamalan twist in this whole situation, and that's that he had told her he was in Alaska. Remember, he's in California, so he tells her he's in Alaska. He's sending her photos of him in Alaska when really he was in sunny California. Anyways, police get there and they start talking to Lori about the whole check fraud situation, and in the course of having this conversation, she mentions to them that Scott may be involved in a case that is far more serious than the check fraud situation, right? So the police are like, tell me more. And she's like, absolutely, I will. And this is when she tells them that her daughter is missing and has been missing for a long time. And that she, Lori, was suspicious that Scott may be involved, but she didn't know for sure. So she stayed with him all this time because he was actually working with the FBI to stop her daughter's case from getting cold. So police hear this and they're like, whoa, I was coming here just expecting to look into this check fraud case thing. And now it's looking like it's way, way bigger than that because they knew for a fact that he did not work for the FBI. Okay, he was not part of that team. Instead, he was a con man who had been in and out of jail 4 years in many different states, starting when he was just 18. Now, none of these arrests were for violent crimes. Arrests, okay. None of these arrests were for violent crimes, but he did have some charges against him for things that could be seen as violent, like he had kidnapping charges against him for when he kidnapped his ex-wife, but those charges ended up being dropped. So all of that's a long-winded way to say that he definitely did not work for the FBI. You can't have a record like that and work for the FBI, but they were able to determine that he was a paid informant for the FBI. That's something that they were able to look into and confirm that he was. So when he said he worked for the FBI, he didn't work for the FBI, but he worked for the FBI, which, had to be very shocking for Lori because, again, her daughter, Kaysi McLeod, has been missing for a long time, and Scott worked for the FBI and was helping her look into her daughter's case. So very quickly, this case went from a check fraud case to him possibly being linked to a missing person. So the police are like, okay, we need to arrest him, right? We need to arrest him for this check fraud thing so that we can have him in custody while we look into him for this missing person situation, because it seems like there is something here and we need to make sure. We need to dot our I's and cross our T's and make sure everything is handled. But turns out this wasn't going to be as easy as they thought it was going to be because, again, as I stated, he was on the run. They just didn't know that yet. So a warrant was put out for his arrest, but it was going to take 2 months for him to be arrested. They were finally able to track him by monitoring his cell phone. And that's when they found that he was in California near the Coachella Valley. So it was March 14th, 2006, when police finally went with the intention of arresting him. But what ended up happening was a high-speed chase that went on for hours. He took off in his F-350 truck. I believe an F-350 is a truck, and he was going 80 miles an hour for hours running from that. Now, while he was running from police, he was actually also in communication with police as well. He was speaking to an officer, and the officer was trying to convince him to stop running, to pull over, to let them take him in. And he just kept telling this cop that no, he wasn't going to do that because he had information. And if he pulled over, he believed that the cops would kill him. Now, as I said, Scott had run 4 hours, but by sundown, his truck had run out of gas. So he rolled to a stop in a field, and you would think that the story would be over there, but no, it was not. He refused to get out of the car. He was like, I am not going to jail today. So again, the standoff continued with him talking to the officer on the phone, occasionally getting out of the truck, but then getting right back in the truck, refusing to be arrested. It was all very dramatic. Until it wasn't, because by 7 o'clock, he just decided that enough was enough and he didn't want to do this anymore. So he actually got out of the truck, was like, fine. He had got me, got down on his knees, surrendered, and was quickly arrested. Now, while in custody for the check fraud situation, police were able to link Scott Kimball to 4 murders. And these murders included the murder of his stepdaughter, Kaysi, and the murder of his own uncle, Terry. But they believe that he could be linked to many more murders, and they believe that it's possible that he tried to murder his own son. So, who was Scott Kimball? Scott Kimball was born September 21st, 1966, to parents Bob and Virgil, and from a young age, police knew who he was, and they knew he was going to be trouble. He had grown up in Old Town Lafayette, which is in Colorado, and had gotten caught as a kid shooting one of his father's guns out a window and into other houses, which is quite the thing for one to do. Growing up, Scott attended Lafayette Elementary and Lafayette Middle Schools, and he spent 1 month at Centaurus High before dropping out as a freshman. In school, he was quiet. He wasn't particularly popular. And if he had friends, which I'm sure he did, most kids do have friends, they haven't come forward to say anything good or bad about him since who he was ended up being revealed to the world. Now, from everything I've read about Scott Kimball, it does seem that he had a bit of an unstable childhood. I would say the shooting the gun into neighbors' houses is pretty evident of that. But I do know that his parents divorced in 1976, which would have been when he was about 10 years old. And from there, his mother went on to get in another relationship, but with a woman, and his father moved out of state. Now, this whole situation, this disillusion of his family, really, he didn't seem to be taking it particularly well, which a lot of kids would not take something like that well, especially at the age of 10. You're old enough to know what's going on, but not really old enough to understand, that families do end and that it has nothing to do with you. But, it's still hard, right? You lose that familial unit, and it was hard for him. So he didn't spend a lot of time at home after that. I didn't see if he was still living with his mother. I mean, his dad left the state, so it seems like he would have been living with his mom, or if he was bouncing around from place to place, because I did read that he spent a lot of time at his grandmother's, but things were not much better for him there. Now, that's not to say his grandma was the problem, because I haven't seen anything that would say that she was. But, okay, so she lived at the Skylark Mobile Home Park. And so Scott would spend a lot of time at that place. And it was while there that he met somebody who was a piece of shit. Yeah, I think that's a good way to describe him. That's probably nicer than he deserves. But this was a 41-year-old man named Theodore Payton. Now, Scott and Theodore developed a friendship. What a 41-year-old man and a 10-year-old boy could possibly have in common that could make the two of them friends is beyond me. But they did. They formed a friendship and they spent time together. They'd go bowling. They'd go on trips to the mountain. They'd play video games together. Theodore would bring him gifts and give him attention. And they would spend time at Theodore's cabin. Now, it did not take long after the two started going to his cabin for Theodore to show his true colors, and the colors were brown because he's a piece of shit. So basically one day Scott was taking a bath, 10-year-old boy taking a bath. He could have been 11 at this point, young boy taking a bath. And Theodore walks in and is like, oh, do you want me to wash your back? And from there it went on to giving the boy a massage. And without getting into specifics, because who would want to hear that, Scott Kimball was abused. During the time that Scott spent with Theodore, he was physically abused, he was sexually abused, emotionally abused, he had photos taken of him, and this went on for years and years, and as the years went by, it got worse and worse. He'd often get Scott drunk, get a child drunk to make him more compliant, and he would threaten this child with a gun, telling him that he would kill him and his whole family if he was ever to tell anybody what was going on in that cabin. And it was the type of thing that it didn't seem like Scott could escape, because even as he got older and he actually left Colorado, moving back with his father in Montana, he wasn't able to escape Ted and Ted's cabin, because whenever he would come back to visit, that's where he'd end up. So this went on for 7 years, from the age of 10 to the age of 17. This was happening to this boy, and it only ended up ending when Scott finally completely separated himself from the situation. He had left the state, he dropped out of school, he started working and trying to make a future and a life for himself. He got into hunting, and he had a job taking clients on big game hunting, which is a big fucking red flag in itself, because I'm going to say now that big game hunting is such a huge no from me. It's kind of ridiculous. All hunting. That might be divisive. I'm not here for it. It's not for me. But anyways, Scott kept what happened to him to himself. He had kept it to himself when he was a kid, and he would continue to keep it to himself for years after the abuse stopped. But eventually this did catch up to him mentally. So when Scott was 23 years old, he was on a hunting trip, I believe with his brother. And at some point during the trip, he left his brother and he went back to, and it was in Montana. Yes. At one point during the trip, he left his brother and he went back to the hotel room by himself. And while he was there, he attempted to take his own life by shooting himself in the head. Now, luckily, he did survive, but he was in the hospital in critical condition for days. Now, this incident was something that Scott's cousin, who, by the way, went on to write a book about Scott after everything about him and what he turned into was revealed. And it's actually where I got a lot of my information for this video. I lost my train of thought. Wait. Oh, after what I was going to say is after this happened, after Scott tried to take his own life, his cousin said that Scott was just different. He said that he noticed a drastic change in him, and it was like he lost all his conscience and he was never the same. And his mother agreed, but she went back even further and said it wasn't just the attempt on his life, it was the abuse that happened to him. Because she said that as time went on, he seemed to be ashamed as a man because of what had happened to him, which is unfortunate because it was not his fault, but he felt ashamed as a man, and anything and everything that went wrong in his life from that point on, he blamed on the abuse he endured as a child. And that's very sad, right? Feel bad for the child. Obviously, fuck the guy he becomes because he is a monster, spoiler alert, but you can feel bad for the child because that sucks. Now, it was after this attempt on his life, that Scott finally went to the police and told them what had happened to him when he was a child at the hands of Theodore. And it turned out that Scott, of course, was not the only child being abused. There were several other kids who came forward and told their stories, and with that, Theodore was promptly arrested and was subsequently convicted by a jury on 6 counts of sexual assault on a child and sentenced to 7 years in prison. 7 years in prison. Let's think about that for a second. That is insane. That is crazy. But what I will say is that this guy, Theodore, is dead now, so rest in piss, you piece of shit. Anyways, after all this, life had moved on. Because, right, he dropped out of school. He got a job. He ended up getting married. He ended up having 2 sons. And for whatever reason, Scott Kimball just could not seem to keep himself out of trouble with the law. His ex-wife, the mother of his 2 children, said that it was not uncommon for them to have a process server on their porch trying to serve him papers at least once a week, which is absolutely crazy to me. Like, that is so much. I mean, I guess unless he was evading service, which they have to keep coming back if that's the case, but it just seems like a lot. And she said that Scott always had an excuse as to why none of these things were his fault. Now, I don't know how their relationship was. I haven't seen a lot of reporting on how it was when they were married, but it couldn't have been too great because the 2 divorced in 1997. And it was after their divorce that the first, at least reported incident that I was able to find of violence from Scott Kimball happened. Okay. And this was, I believe, 2 years after they got a divorce. Was it 2 years or was it 2 months? It was 2 years. 2 years after they had divorced, he kidnapped her. Her name was Larissa, by the way. I don't think I mentioned that. He kidnapped Larissa. He took her, he beat her violently, and he raped her repeatedly. And this was all at gunpoint. Now, Larissa did go to police after this happened, but because the two were still having the occasional consensual sexual encounter after the two separated, the prosecution didn't believe that they were going to have a strong enough case to take this to trial, so they just didn't do anything, which is so whack. Okay, for him to, first off, set aside the trauma that gave her. I don't want to set it aside. I want to stew it in a little bit with you, but we know that's fucked. But then think about the fact that he did something this violent and they were just like, we're not going to do anything about it. That had to embolden him. Now, throughout his years after this, Scott did go on to get married again and divorced again, and was, of course, in and out of jail for several crimes, like writing bad checks, breaking into homes, stealing cars, stealing money from people and businesses where he worked, etc., etc. He would often, he's so ridiculous, he would often go by his brother's name to avoid detection, and even use his brother's name while dating, and sometimes during engagements, because apparently this guy was a real ladies' man, which I don't understand how. And he was able to carry on several relationships at one time with different women. So he would use a fake name so that he could keep things separate. It's a lot. It's a lot. And it just seemed like he was able to convince these women, all women, that he was a good guy. He even had a girlfriend when he finally got arrested for everything. I believe her name was Denise. And after she learned that he was arrested and that he was involved in all these missing people cases, she was blown away. She's like, I thought he was just this good, homegrown country boy who listened to country music. I could never see him being involved in anything like this. That's not the version of him that I knew. Anyways, it was while going in and out of jail on the multiple different occasions when he got himself in trouble that he started to meet people, and he started to find that he was really good at learning information, getting information from people that he came in contact with, which ended up leading to him getting his gig as a police informant. During one of his stays in jail, it sounds like he's at a resort or something, but during one of these stays in jail, he had a cellmate. And in talking to the cellmate, he was able to learn that said cellmate was going to hire a hit, try to murder a federal judge, a federal prosecutor, and 2 witnesses. Okay, and of course, Scott Kimball took this information to the police. In another instance, he was able to give the authorities information about the October 2001 assassination of a federal prosecutor in Seattle named Tom Wales, a murder that is still unsolved to this day, actually. I looked into it and it's still unsolved. Now, this, as I'm sure you can see, would be very helpful information to the police, life-saving information when it came to the judge, the prosecutor, and the 2 witnesses. So police started to look at him and be like, it seems like this guy is pretty good at getting information out of people. Perhaps he could be useful to us. So with that, they ended up taking custody of Scott Kimball. They, waived, or whatever you do, some of outstanding warrants that he had. They were like, Pasha, you don't need to pay for those. You're doing something else. You can work off your, sentence essentially. And from there, within a year, he was released from jail. And it was while out of jail after being released by the FBI, right, by the authorities, that Scott went on to meet a woman named Lori. So Lori and Scott met at a casino. He had been there with his mother, who I believe was in a wheelchair, but I could be misremembering that part, so take that with a grain of salt. But he was there with his mother, and he was being sweet with her, and however he was with his mom, it caught Lori's attention, so the two started to chat. And she liked him. She liked what she was seeing and liked what she was hearing. She thought he was charming and funny, and he liked her. He liked her. They were both divorced. And they both had kids, though he had 2 sons and they were younger than her kids. They still, they had things in common. The point is, the chemistry between the 2 of them was there, and it was palpable to the point that other people at the table were noticing it. And the dealer at their table even said to Lori, oh, are you going to give him your number? And at this, she joked, this part blew my mind. She joked and leaned into him and was like, "You're not a felon, are you?" And when I tell you, when I read that, dead ass, my jaw was on the ground. Okay, maybe not on the ground, but it was a gape. I was like, oh, because he was. But of course he didn't say that. They laughed, they talked more, and they decided to keep in touch after they parted ways. And they did keep in touch because less than a week later, on Valentine's Day, the two started to date. And clearly it went well because in 2001, the two were dating and they were living together in Colorado when Lori's older daughter, Kaysi, moved in with the two of them. And that's how Kaysi ended up getting into Scott's sights. Now with that, let's talk about Kaysi. Kaysi McLeod was the only child born to parents Rob and Lori. She was said to be bright and bubbly and fun. She was a very happy, easy to get along with type of child, the type of kid who always wanted to please you. She was just the type of kid who loved to make you happy. She was the type of kid who would sing a song around the house all day long, which when I tell you, I feel that so deeply because my baby, my boy, has a constant song in his heart. And young Kaysi was the same. And as she got older, she liked different things like jewelry making and dancing and art and music. She was also the type of kid who just really got along with her mother. Like her mom said that she never talked back, which is mind-blowing to me, but that's what she said. She said she got very lucky in that way. Now, since Kaysi was the couple's only daughter, their baby girl, they doted on her and fiercely protected her. Like they said that they kind of kept her in a bubble for the first beginning portion of her life, at least while the two of them were together. They were very overprotective. But things would change, and this was around the time that Kaysi was 4 years old because this is when her parents got a divorce. And from there, things just got a little bit harder. You know, like a one-parent household is inherently harder because it's one person and you can't be everywhere at once. So you take that and you add the fact that Kaysi also started to get very rebellious. So there's less supervision and they now have a more difficult child. And then, you know, as she got older, the child who, you know, never talked back before, as she got into her teen years, really started to butt heads with her mother. She was getting herself into trouble, doing things she shouldn't do, like getting piercings and getting tattoos. She got the tattoo of a 4-leaf clover and a Virgo sign and the tattoo of a fairy. Real rebellious stuff there. But she was just overall breaking the rules. That is the point here. So after the divorce from Kaysi's father, Kaysi and her mother moved to Arizona, and it's there that her life changed. First, in a good way. She was a teenager and she made a friend. This is a girl named Tabitha, and they became best friends quickly. And as you oftentimes see in teenage friendships with girls, they ended up attached at the hip. They went to school together. They ended up working together. Like they were very close. After high school, though, things started to change, and that's because Kaysi fell in with a different type of crowd. She had gotten her own apartment and ended up getting a roommate, and this roommate used drugs, had a lot of friends who used drugs, and from there, Kaysi herself started to use drugs. Now, I mentioned that she had this friend named Tabitha because it was Tabitha who actually noticed that Kaysi was going down a bad path. It's like whatever anybody else wants to do is fine and well, but this wasn't good for Kaysi. So she took it upon herself to reach out to Kaysi's family like a real one and tell them what was going on. And from there, they came up with the plan that Well, they did come up with a plan. Basically, they thought it would be a good idea for Kaysi to move back to Colorado for a fresh start, away from the people that she was hanging out with and away from the access to the drugs, right? Because she knew too many people here who could supply her if she got desperate, which does happen when people are trying to quit drugs. So in 2001, she did. She moved back to Colorado and moved in with her mother, Lori, and her mother's boyfriend/fiance, Scott, for a fresh start. Now, what was sort of magical about this sort of, I don't want to say intervention because it really isn't an intervention in the traditional sense that you picture with like a group of people intervening on her, but it was technically an intervention because Tabitha did intervene on the path that Kaysi was heading down. I lost my train of thought again. Wait. Oh, the point is that what was sort of magical here is that Tabitha and Kaysi didn't grow apart after this, because I could absolutely see a situation where Kaysi would be upset at her for overstepping and talking to her family and getting her into trouble, etc., etc. But that wasn't the case. They didn't grow apart. If anything, they actually got stronger because Kaysi knew that Tabitha was just looking out for her and looking out for what was best for her. And something I want to mention here, something that is important to those who love Kaysi and know Kaysi, is that people understand that this short period of time where Kaysi had a problem with drugs does not define her. It is not who she is. And it's so fucked up that families even have to come out and say things like this and when these sort of cases happen. But you know that they do, because there is a bias towards people with substance abuse issues. It's like certain people see people that have these issues as less than, as their murders being less tragic. And it's just incredibly frustrating. But anyways, she is back in Colorado. She's living with her mom, Lori, and her mom's boyfriend / fiance, Scott Kimball, and things seem to be doing well. She seems to be happy. She's made new friends. She has a job. Everything was just going so perfectly until it wasn't, because one day Scott came to Lori saying that he had found drugs and drug paraphernalia in their house. Now, in learning this, Lori did go and confront Kaysi, and Kaysi swore up and down that the drugs were not hers. She's like, you can even give me a drug test, okay? This is not mine. But her mom didn't believe her. Like, would you have believed her in that situation? I can't say that I would have. So her mom, not sure what to do, believing that her daughter has come here and then brought drugs into her house and now was lying to her face about it, she told Kaysi, like, I'm going to call the cops. And from there, Kaysi dipped. She got on her bike and she took off, and she didn't come back. And her mom was so worried when she didn't come back, she actually went out and looked for her. She drove around and looked for her, but didn't find her. And in hindsight, she believes that Kaysi left because she was so upset that her mom didn't believe her. Now, in hindsight, Lori does not believe those drugs were Kaysi's. She believes that Scott planted them in an attempt to drive a wedge between her and her daughter so that he could take her and do whatever he wanted with her. But that's hindsight, right? That's hindsight. It doesn't stop her from feeling incredibly guilty, but she couldn't have known that because at the time, that's not who Scott was to her. She didn't know who he actually truly was, but that doesn't lessen how she feels. And she said of this, and I quote, "Obviously, I blame myself because I'm the one who brought Scott into our lives. I would give anything for a do-over. Life doesn't offer that." So anyways, she leaves, she goes out, she looks for Kaysi, she cannot find her. So Scott goes out, looks for Kaysi, and he does find her, which sounds like a lie, but no, he actually did. He found Kaysi, so he gets a hotel room for her and for her boyfriend, and after that, her mom talks to her, so we know that she was okay at that point, and it just seemed like Kaysi needed to cool off, and things would be fine, and she would be back. But she never did come back. So 2 days after she left her mom's home on August 23rd, 2003, 19-year-old Kaysi failed to show up at her shift she worked at Subway. Okay, so she fails to show up for her shift. And this was after her boyfriend said that Scott Kimball had come and picked her up and offered to drive her to work. Now, her boyfriend didn't realize she was missing until much later in the day after the shift would have been over because she didn't come home. So when he reaches out to her work, he finds out that she never even showed up for work. So he gets very, very concerned. And he goes to Lori and he tells Lori what happened, that Kaysi's missing, that Scott picked her up to take her to work, but that she never ended up at work. And Scott flat out denies this, says that he never picked her up, that he wasn't even in town when she went missing, that he was off alone in the mountains. Now, I don't know why exactly Kaysi's mom didn't believe her boyfriend. I don't know what the relationship was there. I don't know if he wasn't a trustworthy guy or if she just trusted Scott more. But the fact is, Kaysi was missing. She didn't show up for work, and her mom did go into a panic because her leaving home and, them fighting was not that unusual, but her not showing up to work, she'd never do that. So with that, her mother went to the police, and as we see in so many cases, she was basically shut down right away. They were like, listen, she's an adult. She's allowed to disappear. She can go wherever she wants, and you have no right to find her, basically. And he's an Asian, and even as time went on and Kaysi still did not come home, the police refused to let her file a missing persons report, saying that there was no blood evidence to support foul play. And that was that. So, she was super worried, and her father seemed to be, he was worried for sure, but he was less worried. He assumed that everything was going to be fine. He said she had run away before, so though he was worried and angry, he didn't think anything bad had happened. He just figured that she was at a friend's house doing what she needed to do, that she was crashing, that eventually she would show back up. But she never did. So time was going by, and nobody was hearing from Kaysi, but Lori was under the impression that her daughter's case was being looked into. And that was because even though she wasn't able to file a missing persons report, her boyfriend, well, now husband, Scott Kimball, said that he was looking into it, that even though the local police would not help her, he was going to do everything in his power to use his connections at the FBI, because that's where he worked, to locate Kaysi. And she had no reason to question him or to think this wasn't true, because he would go away to do trips for the FBI and he'd return with payments from the FBI. So it all seemed to be checking out. Oh, and you may have noticed that I said husband now, and that's because the two did go on to get married. They actually got married 8 days after Kaysi went missing in Vegas, and then they went honeymooning, and they went like camping to go honeymooning, and it turns out they were camping really close to the area where Kaysi's body would eventually be found, and they were actually camping on Kaysi's 20th birthday, a date that her father now remembers her by doing a 100-mile bike ride every year on her birthday. Now, during this camping trip, even though it was supposed to be, a joyous, loving moment, Lori was having trouble being so joyous and loving because her daughter was missing and she was worried about her. And she had actually brought a diary on this camping trip, which I'm not a journaler, right? So I don't know how common that would be, but she did. And she wrote about her missing daughter, quote, "Happy 20th birthday, sweet love. I hope wherever you are enjoying your day. I miss you and wish I could celebrate you. Anticipating your arrival 20 years ago today, I was in the most severe pain I thought I would ever feel. That would also not be the last time I would be wrong in my life." Which, how heartbreaking. Now, as I said, Scott was investigating Kaysi's disappearance, and he did actually seem to be bringing evidence to Lori to show that Kaysi was okay. He was even able to bring evidence to Lori that showed that Kaysi had been coming into their house when they weren't there. Like, she wasn't going when they were there. She was waiting for them to leave and go to like work or wherever they would go. And then she would come in the house. And he was able to prove this by different items being in the house or being out of the house when they should have been there or not there, right? So basically, they found a necklace of hers hanging on a doorknob, which showed that she had been there and had left that there. And then a box of Kaysi's makeup that had been in the house was now gone. So obviously she must be coming and going when we're not around because she doesn't want to see you. So you take that, and you also take the fact that he said that he had confirmed with was it the landlord or the neighbor? The neighbor/landlord, that they had seen Kaysi and her boyfriend out in the neighborhood since she went missing. Okay, so you take all that, you add it together, and it does seem like Kaysi is there, alive and well, just avoiding her mother. But here's the thing, she's supposedly out there, okay, just avoiding her mom, but it wasn't just her mom that she wasn't talking to. In the time she was missing, she wasn't contacting anyone, like no friends, no family. Her best friend Tabitha had been trying to get a hold of her and couldn't. She called everyone that she knew. She set up a MySpace page for her, a MySpace page that for a long time after her disappearance, her father would look at almost every day just to look at her, to feel close to her. But there were some days that he couldn't even do that because he just knew that he couldn't handle looking at her photos. Tabitha also passed out flyers, and still nothing, dude. Weeks turned into months, then turned into a year, and still nobody had heard from her. And by this time, people did not think that Kaysi had just run away. Specifically, her best friend Tabitha. She said of this, and I quote, "It just became more and more unlike her not to get a hold of me in some way through an email or give me a call." Something like that. And then she added, quote, "It was just this nagging feeling that kept going through my head that there was something more than what we were finding." And you know what? It wasn't just Tabitha who was feeling this way. Rob and Lori, Scott's wife, were feeling this way too. With her father, Rob, saying that like he could not handle thinking that somebody may have took his daughter away from him. That somebody could just take her and throw her away like trash, like she didn't matter at all. Like, who could do something like that? And for Lori, she suspected that she may know. She suspected that the man that she loved, that she married, that she brought around her daughter may be responsible for her disappearance, but she just wasn't sure. She said that she just didn't trust her gut, that Scott would say things that didn't quite add up right, and then she'd bring it to his attention, and he would gaslight her into making her feel like she was losing her mind. And she said something that I thought was interesting, and she said that she hoped that maybe she was losing her mind, because the alternative of what she was feeling would be too horrifying. So she waited and she stayed, even though she had her suspicions against her husband, and even though her relationship with him had become completely toxic. The two fought often, and at one point, Lori herself even ended up being arrested on suspicion of third-degree assault, criminal mischief, and domestic violence after her husband, Scott Kimball, claimed that she threw a vacuum cleaner at him, keyed his truck, and threatened to kill him, though she says he was lying. But he got a restraining order, and I guess she violated it at some point and then got arrested again, so it was clearly a toxic relationship. But even so, she stuck around. She stuck around just in case he was involved, or just in case he wasn't, since if he wasn't involved, he was the one person out there who was actually looking for her daughter. Now, she didn't voice her concerns or her gut feeling about what may have happened to her daughter until 2 years after she went missing. And when she did, she finally went to her ex, to Kaysi's dad, and told him about her suspicions, and also told him that he didn't know everything about the weekend that Kaysi disappeared. And this is when she told him that the weekend that Kaysi disappeared, Scott also went away for that entire weekend. Now, I don't know how he reacted to this conversation, but I think it's probably safe to say that it was a tense situation, because there's a chance that she's right. You know, there's a chance that she's correct and that this man is responsible for the disappearance of their daughter, but they don't know for sure, right? All they know is that she's missing, and her father's freaking out, wondering if she's hurt, if she's hungry, if she's taken care of. And what's super fucked up here is that he did not know that at the same time he was asking these questions, another family was asking these questions, because 7 months before Kaysi disappeared on January 16, 2003, 24-year-old LeAnn Emry went missing after telling her family that she was going to Mexico with some friends to go caving, but she never made it there. Now, LeAnn's story is somewhat similar to Kaysi's in that she was from a loving family and had a bright future ahead of her, but ended up getting dealt a bad hand and went down a bad path. Her father said of his daughter's life, and I quote, "It is a sad story. The story about a young girl who was smart, intelligent, beautiful, and went from having everything going for her, and then certain circumstances happened that spiraled her down, and her life just got worse and worse." LeAnn Emry was born to parents Howard and Darlene, and she was actually born in the same room in the same farmhouse where her own mother had been born. She was in many ways a golden child. She went to Eagle Crest High School in Colorado, where she was a straight A student, even graduating a year early in 1995, despite the fact that she struggled with mental health problems starting from when she was a teen, being diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and also spending her years dealing with chronic back pain, which if you've had back pain, I cannot imagine chronic back pain. But despite that, despite everything she was dealing with, she worked super hard and she was able to push through, and she graduated ahead of her class. She went on to get a job as a veterinary assistant. She was going to college. She had big plans and this bright future ahead of her. But after high school, things changed for her a little bit. And by a little bit, I mean a lot of it. So basically, her mother was not doing great. She had some pretty serious health problems at the time, and LeAnn decided that she was going to quit going to college so that she could be there to help take care of her mother. And she ended up, so that happened, and then she ended up losing her job as the veterinary assistant, and from there, things just progressively seemed to get worse and to get worse. During this time, she also met and married a man who really wasn't the best for her. He was in and out of jail a lot, and I think he was even in jail when the two got married. And once he was released from jail, he was said to be very abusive to her. Her life just changed so much so quickly, from finishing school early, going to college and working for a vet, and now she had dropped out of school, was in an abusive relationship, and was working as a stripper for private parties. Her dad said that he felt like this was the turning point for her, that like she believed that her life wasn't worth much and then there wasn't much she could do about it. Now, in 2002, it seemed for a moment like things were actually going to be getting better, that things were going to be changing. And that's because LeAnn was able to get herself out of that abusive relationship. And for a moment, her family had hopes that things really were going to get better, but then their hopes were quickly squashed when LeAnn got into another relationship with a guy that they didn't think was the best. It was a man who was in federal prison for robbing banks named Steven. When they learned this, they just weren't expecting the best outcome, from this relationship, just history repeating itself. But they were surprised to see that she actually did seem to be getting better after getting out of that relationship and getting into this new relationship. She was going out, making friends, making plans. Things seemed good. She was even spending time with her family. She had gone to see them in Colorado because at this time she had moved to Texas. So she comes back to Colorado. She visits them. She sits with them and spends time with them and goes through old photos, asking them which photos were her favorite or were their favorites. And this is something that they really cling to and a memory they hold very dear because this happened just weeks before she disappeared. I guess on this day, she was frantically looking for a particular photo which stood out to them. It was a photo of her from when she was 3 years old and she was, quote, grimacing from a cat scratch that she had. And I guess she showed her family once they found the photo. She showed it to them and was like, this is how I feel. And at the time, it didn't mean anything to them. But in hindsight, her father latches onto that a bit and feels like this was her way of telling him that she was in trouble and she needed help. And he feels like an idiot for not being able to put two and two together in realizing that, which I don't think is fair to him. Obviously, he's going to feel how he feels because he lost his daughter, right? He is entitled to feel how he feels. But I do think he holds on to blame that isn't his to hold on to. You know what I mean? Because how could you know by her showing you a photo of this is how I feel that she's telling you she's in danger? You know what I mean? It's just one of those things that you think about after the fact because you have nothing else to hold on to because she's not here. And you know, that's because a few weeks after this, she saw her parents for the last time. She was at their house and she was packing up her car to go on a trip to Mexico with some friends to go caving, which caving? No. Thank you. If you've ever looked into caving, I don't know how anybody does that for fun. But she did. She was really into it and had been doing it a ton around that time. So that was that. She packed her car. She got in. She said her goodbyes. And on the way, she called her sister to tell her sister that in case anything happened to her, she wanted her sister to know that she loved her. Now, while she was gone, her family knew that she was busy. She was with friends. She was doing her own thing. So it wasn't weird for them not to hear from her. Okay, so 2 weeks went by, and this is when they received a call from the sheriff's office in Moab, Utah. The sheriff was calling them to tell them that a car had been found that they believed belonged to LeAnn, and it was abandoned in the Canyon lands. And as soon as they described the car, and specifically the license plate, her dad knew that it was her car, and his heart sank because she had a very unique license plate. It was a vanity plate that said Dalgal, like Dalgal, and that's because this girl loved Dalmatians. She even had a Dalmatian, and in addition to having the vanity plate that said Dalgal, she also had like one of those license plate holders that said like Dalmatians rule. So it was very unique and specific to LeAnn. Now, one of the things that is weird about this car being found is that police didn't seem to notice or care that something looked off, that she was missing and clearly had to have been at least picked up because she's gone. Okay. And what's odd is that all of her stuff is still in the car. Like all of the clothes and stuff that she packed to take on this trip to Mexico is in the car. The only thing missing is her debit cards. And on top of that, as I said, she had to have been picked up, and it was clear that somebody had been there to pick her up because there were another set of tire tracks and then footprints from LeAnn's car to said tire tracks. Now, her parents, just like Kaysi's, were shot down when they tried to file a missing persons report. They were told, she's an adult. She can do what she wants to do. She's allowed to disappear. And then they told her parents, and this will shock you here, they told her parents that once they found a dead body, then they'd start looking into it. Yeah. And what's so fucked up here is her parents absolutely believe that LeAnn's lifestyle and her history with mental illness is why the police didn't take their daughter's case more seriously. And her father says that he hopes that they make changes, that they, the police officers, don't get to make the choice about whether or not somebody else has the right to live, has the right to exist, even if their lives aren't the most ethical or the best. Which, louder for those in the back, please. Come on, guys. These are people. These are human beings. Now, even though the police weren't going to help LeAnn's family, that didn't mean that they could just sit by and do nothing. Her father said that he could not deal with the questions in his head. Where was she? Was she taken? Is she safe? He said there were a million questions swirling around that he couldn't find answers to. So he decided to be productive with that and decided to kind of play detective himself and see just how much he could figure out about what happened to his daughter. And boy, what a wild ride he was in for. He found that his daughter was keeping secrets from him. She had not gone to Mexico, which we already know because her car was found in Utah that she never made it there. But what he found from looking into her is that she never even planned to go there. He was able to tell using credit card reports that LeAnn, for 10 days after leaving, had gone all over the place to Wyoming, Oregon, Nevada, Washington, and then back to Colorado, but most notably, not to Mexico. And to this day, they have no idea what she was doing or why she was doing it, but what they do know is that she was using her father's cards and pulling out money from his accounts and writing bad checks. Now, if you're curious, like, how do they know this was her? Because the whole bad checks would make you think it was Scott Kimball. Well, spoiler alert, he was there. But they were able to determine that this was her because, for one, she bought a gift certificate and she sent it to her sister. 11 days after she went missing, she actually did call her father one time. So they were able to, know that she was at least alive then. And during that time period, she did check into a hotel, and the person who worked there remembered seeing her. They said that she had cut her hair short and dyed it dark, which is something we'll talk about later. So they knew she was okay. And I just realized that earlier I said that they didn't hear from her at all until the sheriff called after 2 weeks that she went missing. I mean, they didn't hear from her much. They clearly heard from her, 11 days after she went missing, but that was it. Now, her father, in learning all this, was very confused and says that he just knows his daughter was in trouble, that she had to have been threatened or blackmailed because these just weren't choices she would have made on her own. And in looking into her situation more thoroughly, it does seem like that may be correct because he started going through her emails. And in going through her emails, he found some emails from her to a cousin where she expressed that she was in some sort of trouble, but that she had some help and some protection from a guy named Hannibal. In these emails, she said that Hannibal was a person that she thought she could trust and somebody who was protecting her. But then in the same breath, she said that if Hannibal, knew that she was talking to her cousin about him, he would kill her and kill her cousin. So that doesn't sound very trustworthy and protecting to me. But anyways, her dad's reading this and he's like, what the fuck is going on? Like, who is Hannibal? What is happening? Meme of Bear Claw from New Girl. What is happening? And you know what? He would get some answers about this or some information about Hannibal. And this would actually come from LeAnn's prison boyfriend, Stephen Hawley. I know there's a lot of names I'm throwing out here. That's why I'm saying serial killer cases are hard to look into. And this one in particular has so many people and moving parts. But we're all smart. You're smart. I'm smart. We can do this together. So basically what happened here is Stephen had not heard from his girlfriend in some time and he got worried. So he wrote a letter to LeAnn's father, Howard. And then LeAnn's father, Howard, wrote back saying that LeAnn was missing. And at that, Stephen wrote back something very concerning. And this was that he believed that she was in great danger. He said that LeAnn had recently been in communication with a guy named Hannibal, okay? And that though he didn't think Hannibal would hurt her, Hannibal had connections with people who could very well want to hurt LeAnn. So this is what the boyfriend is writing to the dad. Stephen then tells Howard that he needs to reach out to the FBI and needs to reach out to one particular agent, specifically, which coincidentally, this agent had spoken to LeAnn before. So Howard, LeAnn's dad, actually wonders if LeAnn may have also been a police informant, though the police have never came out and confirmed this. This is just something that he speculates. Okay. So in learning from Stephen that he should reach out to this FBI agent because LeAnn might be in trouble, he immediately obliges, right? Because everything that Stephen's saying is adding up. Hannibal, her being missing, her being in danger, this all makes sense. Now, when her dad did this, even though she was missing, even though everything that Stephen was saying was making sense, the police dismissed it. They didn't want to look into it. They didn't want to look into Hannibal, and they basically just said that Stephen Hawley was a liar and not to take anything he said too seriously, which, I mean, I don't know how her father felt about that, but this guy was in jail. I mean, how could he trust what he's saying? So nothing happened. Nothing happened. And time, man, it marched on. Time marched on with nobody knowing where LeAnn was and nobody knowing who Hannibal was, which, spoiler alert, it was Scott Kimball. And, nobody knew that LeAnn's case was also related to the disappearance of a girl named Kaysi. There were so many things happening at the same time that nobody knew. But a connection would be made 3 years after LeAnn disappeared in June of 2006. It was at this time that Rob, Kaysi's father, was reading an article in probably a magazine. I was going to say the newspaper. He was reading an article somewhere. And it was an article about a man who had recently put up a billboard to try to get information about his missing daughter. So he sees it's a man with a missing daughter. Of course it's going to grab his attention, right? But then he reads further into the article, and that's when his heart sinks, because in this article it mentions that the last person this girl was known to have seen and spoken with was a man named Scott Kimball. Sounds familiar, right? But here's the thing. The man in the article was not Howard. It was not LeAnn's father, if that's where your mind was going. The man in the article was a man. The man in the article was a man. The man in the article was named Bob Marcum, and he was looking for his 25-year-old daughter, Jennifer, who had been missing since February of 2003, the same year that the other two girls went missing. So, Jennifer Marcum. She was born in Denver, Colorado to parents Bob and Mary, but grew up most of her life in Springfield, Illinois. And like the two girls we discussed prior to Jennifer, she also had a difficult life. I can't say how her childhood was, but I know that when she got older, things just got a little rocky. She dropped out of high school in 1996, got married pretty young, and moved from Illinois back to Colorado with her husband, who was in the military, had a baby, and sort of separated from her family. Now, it doesn't seem like there was any drama there. Like, that's not why she didn't really talk to her family. It's just that she was an adult. She was a young adult for sure, but she was an adult and she had her own family at this point. She had a husband and she had a baby. So she was just focusing on that and doing what she had to do. And sometimes she and her family would go months without talking, and then they just talk and it would be like no time had even passed. But anyways, Jennifer's marriage to the military man did not last, and the two divorced in, I believe, 1999. And after she divorced from this guy, she did go on to get pregnant again. I can't say if she was in a relationship with whoever she got pregnant from, but I can say that he wasn't really in the picture in any substantial way. So she then went on to be a single mother with 2 babies. So that's a lot, right? That's expensive. And to provide for her family, Jennifer, who was obviously beautiful, ended up taking a job as a stripper at Shotgun Willie's, which was like a bar where you could eat and smoke cigars and, see women. So she worked there under the name Francesca. So fancy Francesca. Now, during that time, she was said to have graduated from just stripping to engaging in a little bit of sex work, but it didn't seem to be something that lasted very long, because shortly after even beginning, she called her mother in hysterics after she had gone on, like a date and got really beaten up by a guy. So she stopped doing that pretty quickly. Around this time, she also went on to get into a new relationship. This was with a guy who was not a great guy, and his name was Stephen Ennis. So now we have several Steves in this video, but we'll try to keep them sorted because not all of them are terribly important, but they all come up from time to time. So she's in this relationship with this guy, Stephen, and he's not a great guy. He is an ecstasy dealer in New York and Colorado. Like, he's slinging shit all over the place, and he ended up getting arrested after the DEA got onto him, so he ended up in jail. Now, it was Stephen, her boyfriend, who was one of the last people to see her alive. She had come to visit him in February of 2003, February 17th, 2003. And shortly after that visit, she disappeared. Now, the problem here is that it wasn't noticed that she was missing right away. I can't say where her kids were, because obviously you would think that that would make it pretty noticeable that she was gone. I don't know where they were. I didn't see that in the reporting. But her family didn't notice because they wouldn't talk to her for long periods of time. Sometimes she was even known to turn her cell phone off when she didn't want to talk to somebody. But eventually she would turn it back on and she would call. But that call never came. And during that time she was missing, her father did actually start to get worried and reached out to her and left her a voicemail where he was just like, hey, listen, give me a call back when you can. Like, nothing bad's happened. I just want to make sure you're okay, because I haven't heard from you in a while. But she never called back. So time went on, and her family did think it was odd that they hadn't heard back in so long. And they were getting a little scared and a little bit anxious, wondering where she was. But they thought that the best case scenario here was that maybe she had gotten arrested and she hadn't called because she couldn't call. And that once she got out, she just would. Like, this was the idea they were operating under. But then after a year with no answers as to where Jennifer was and no calls from Jennifer to let them know she was okay, her father received a call that nobody ever wants to receive. The person on the other end of the line was an FBI agent. And this FBI agent said that they were calling to speak to Jennifer. And her father's like, well, I don't know where she is, guy. Like, she's been missing for over a year. We haven't heard from her. We don't know what's going on. And the FBI agent's like, I was kind of worried about that. And then tells her father that Jennifer's car was found abandoned at the Denver International Airport. The Denver airport, the big one with the horse, the evil horse, you know what I'm talking about? Her car was found abandoned there, and there weren't any records that showed that she flew anywhere. And what's super fucked up here, well, that's already fucked up. But he tells him, okay, her father finds out that this actually happened. Her car was actually abandoned there a year prior. A year prior. So they knew she was missing all this time. Her car was there, and they didn't contact the family. So they had no idea anything had happened, which is just so unbelievable. But here we fucking find ourselves. Now, in learning that Jennifer's car had been found and that Jennifer was missing and she had been missing all this time, obviously her parents were a little bit frantic. Okay, this is the worst news any parent could possibly get, because it looks like their daughter's been missing for a year and no one has done anything about it. So they start blowing up the police phones, basically. They're calling all the time. They're trying to get all the information they can. They want updates. They want answers, dude. And finally, the police do something. Something perhaps questionable, but something. And that's that they connected Jennifer Marcum's parents with a jailhouse informant who they think may have some information on what happened to Jennifer. Why it's her parents' job to have this conversation, I cannot say, but this is what happened. This man went by the name Joe Snitch, and he was a guy who had once been a cellmate with Jennifer's boyfriend who was in prison, the ecstasy dealer. So in learning this, they're like, okay, this sounds promising, and so they arranged a meeting with him. So Jennifer's parents meet with this guy, Joe Snitch, at a park. And while there, he tells them everything. He tells them that Jennifer was murdered by one of her boyfriend's drug associates. And he even tells her parents that he saw photos of Jennifer dead. Can you even imagine being in that situation? Her mother said of this quote, "He told me she was strangled. She was tied up and she was strangled from behind. And she put up a fight. I was thinking, how could he know this? How could he know this indeed? That does seem like a good amount of information for somebody who wasn't there to have. But wait, there's more." As their park rendezvous was coming to an end and they were about to part ways, Joe Snitch said to her parents, quote, "If you stay till tomorrow, I'll go up in the mountains with you and take you up in the mountains to show you where she's at." Now, neither of Jennifer's parents took him up on this offer because after meeting with Joe, Mr. Snitch, if you nasty, they had decided that this man knew too much. He had way too much information and the vibes were just off. So at this point, they were convinced that this man, not a random drug associate of Jennifer's boyfriend who was in jail, this man was responsible for what happened to their daughter. And if they had gone up in the mountains with him that following day, they never would have come back down. This is what they believed. On top of that, during this encounter, during this meeting, he had made Jennifer's mother specifically so uncomfortable. He had the audacity to tell this woman who's looking for information about her murdered daughter that if he was to come to her hotel room that night and she was to allow him in, he would, quote, demonstrate for her, this is a loose quote, he would demonstrate to her what the killer had done to Jennifer, her own child. Okay, that's disgusting. And of course she declined. But that didn't stop him from showing up at her hotel room that night, dude. According to Jennifer's mother, he showed up at her hotel room that night at midnight with a contract for her to sign. And this contract said that she was giving him permission to bind her, to gag her, and to have sex with her. And when I read that, I was like, he did what now? But that's what she said happened. And she said that she refused, obviously, and that he was pissed. She said that he left all mad, that he went down to the parking lot, like circled the parking lot all quick before peeling out. And she says she just knows if she had let him in her room that night, she would be dead too. So overall, as I'm sure I have demonstrated in this telling, this was a very awkward and scary interaction that they had with Mr. Joe Snitch, who was, spoiler alert, Scott Kimball. Okay? And this was a man that her family very much believed was responsible for their daughter's death. So here comes another very frustrating part of this case. When Jennifer's parents told the FBI about their suspicions against Mr. Joe Snitch. Suspicions against Snitch. When her parents went to the FBI and were like, hey, we think he's responsible. He said some weird shit. He did some weird shit. And they told them, like, specifically what this guy did. The FBI turned them down, was like, no, 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 and defended their informant. Which I'm sure you can imagine this was a very upsetting for them. They were like, wow, they really put this trust in this fucking dick. And they shouldn't have. They truly believed that the FBI introduced him to this guy and had them meet this guy so that they would feel bad about who Jennifer was as a person because of the stuff that he revealed to them. And that was not how her family felt. And her father even said of this quote, "I didn't care because I loved Jennifer. And no matter what she did, we want her back." And I think they really thought that by doing this, we would become one of those families that would just turn around and get into an airplane and go home. And Jennifer would just be disappeared. So knowing he wasn't going to get any help from the police, he decided he was going to take things into his own hands. We have a theme here. He wanted answers. So he reached out to a Colorado-based nonprofit. He and his wife reached out to the Colorado-based nonprofit group that's called Families of Homicide Victims and Missing Persons. This group actually was founded by a man named Howard Morton, whose eldest child went missing in 1975. And it was this group that helped Jennifer's family be able to put up that billboard in front of Shotgun Willie's, just hoping that somehow this would lead to someone coming forward with some information. And it did work, because if you recall, it was an article about this billboard being put up that Rob, Kaysi's father, saw that let him know that his daughter was not the only missing person that was linked to Scott Kimball. Rob, in seeing this, called Bob. So Rob is Kaysi's dad. Bob is Jennifer's dad. Rob calls Bob. Okay. And I can only imagine how this conversation went, because he started by saying, quote, "My daughter is missing. My wife is married to Scott Kimball." When I tell you, can you see the bumps? Goosebumps, chills. It gets me. This whole case just got under my skin. So after having this conversation, they realized that they should probably go and talk to Rob's ex-wife, Lori, Scott Kimball's wife, Kaysi's mother. And in doing so, they learned that she too has her suspicions against Scott. Okay. And they learned that there is yet another person who went missing who is linked to Scott. And this was his own uncle, Terry Kimball. Terry had randomly disappeared after coming to stay with Scott and Lori after Scott's young son, Justin, had had a, quote, near fatal accident. An accident that many people, including Justin, the boy that the accident happened to, don't believe was an accident at all, and instead believe that it was Scott's attempt to murder his own son. So they get there and they start talking to Lori. They talk about Kaysi. They talk about Jennifer. And the men ask her, they're like, okay, is there anyone else that you know of that was linked to Scott Kimball who just randomly disappeared with no explanation? And the men said that she was sitting there and she sort of like sat back in her chair and looked like a light bulb went off in her head. And that's when she told them, like, yes, there was somebody else, because Scott Kimball's uncle Terry had come to stay with them a while. And one day she came home from work and he was just gone. And Scott told her that Terry had won the lottery and ran off to Mexico with some random woman. Now, Terry Kimball was Scott's 60-year-old uncle who had come to Colorado to help Scott and to be with his grandnephew, Justin, who was actually at that time in a coma in the Children's Hospital of Denver. Basically, what had happened is one evening in July of 2004, Scott had been outside with his two sons. And one of those sons was Justin, right? And they were outside. They were just messing around, digging holes and chasing mice, being little boys, okay? So at one point during the evening, one of the brothers went inside, right? Not Justin, the other one. I forget his name. He goes inside. So it leaves just Scott and his son Justin alone in the yard. Now, according to Justin, what happened next is that his father told him to dig a hole, and to dig a hole in a specific spot and to look the opposite way, to not look at him, basically. So he said that's what he was doing when all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he saw flashes of light and like stars in front of his eyes. And that's because a 200-pound metal cattle grate had just fallen on top of his head. Okay, just picture that. I believe this was like a 10-year-old boy. Okay, so in response to this, Scott scoops him up, runs him to where he was parked. He puts him in his Jeep and he goes to take him to the hospital because he's in terrible shape. Like where he had been laying, there was like a 5-inch pool of blood already left behind from when they picked him up. So they're driving down the road. They're rushing to the hospital when, according to Justin, Scott shoved him out of the moving vehicle because it's a Jeep and you know how they don't have like the full doors. He says his father shoved him out of the moving vehicle. Now, obviously, this would be very traumatic. He said he fell out, that he smacked his head on the pavement, he rolled, and he said that Scott then stopped, scooped him up, put him back in the Jeep, and headed to the hospital. Now, once they got to the hospital, Scott told them what his version of what happened was, that his son was outside playing when the grate accidentally fell on his head, that he scooped him up and put him in the car. And he said that, yes, his son did fall out of the car, but it's because his son was like wailing in pain and like trying to open the window for whatever reason and accidentally hit the door and fell out of the car on his own. Now, Justin was in such bad shape that he actually had to be airlifted to Children's Hospital in Denver, where he underwent emergency surgery on his brain and a fractured skull. And after that, he was placed in a medically induced coma. Now, it was touch and go for a while because obviously these are horrible injuries, but somehow after 2 weeks, Justin woke up. He woke up from this coma and he survived. And what was even more amazing than this is that he seemed to remember what happened, and he told them what happened. He said that he had been outside and his father had pushed that grate on top of him. And he said that once they were in the vehicle together, his father had purposely pushed him out of the car. And he said specifically of this, and I quote, "What I do remember him pushing me out was by my face, because I remember how big his hand was and how warm it felt on my cold face." He also said that during that time, he didn't know if he was going to live, and that this scared him as a child because, one, like, death is terrifying, and two, he was worried that nobody would know that his father did this to him, because it was very, very clear to him that his dad was trying to kill him, but was going to make it look like an accident. And he was worried if he died, nobody would ever know that. Now, why? Why would Scott do this? Why would any parent do this to their child? That's a good question. But the answer is a tale as old as time. And that's that they found out that right before this happened, Scott had been shopping around for life insurance and had taken out a $50,000 policy against his son. So if his son died, he would get that money. He literally took out this policy and made himself the sole beneficiary. Now, even though Justin told everybody who would listen that this had happened to him, the doctor said that because of his head injury, his memories could be convoluted. And when prosecutors learned this, they thought that he wouldn't be a reliable witness, and therefore no legal action was taken against Scott, which is so fucked up. I cannot imagine being this man's son and just learning that your dad was just going to get away from it. And I wonder if he was able at a point to like convince himself that maybe what he was remembering wasn't true. It's got to be very difficult for a child. But I mentioned all this, one, to show you that Scott Kimball's a piece of shit, and two, so you understand why Terry Kimball packed up his car, packed up 2 of his dogs, and headed to Colorado to be with his family. Anyways, once he got to Colorado, he moved in and started staying with Scott and Lori in their home. And he actually ended up staying in the room that used to belong to Kaysi, because at this point, she had been missing for a year. So he's moved in there. He's hanging out. He's helping take care of the kid. And he starts working for Scott for his beef business, which I found to be very wild, because he basically just like abandoned his whole life to come here and do this, even getting a job. Because I don't even think I mentioned this yet, but Terry was married. He had a wife, and his wife was not comfortable with him like running off and going and staying with Scott, because she knew who Scott was. She knew he had a criminal record, and she just didn't really trust him. And plus, she like wanted Terry there. He was like a fixture in her home and in her life. She said he was always cooking elaborate meals. And so she's like, hello, you're just going to like leave and get a job and not come back. But I guess, you know, Terry was a very independent guy. Which there's independence, and then there's like leaving your wife of a decade when she wants you home. But that's what he did. And it wasn't like a super weird thing for him to do either. He had taken extended trips before, so this wasn't out of the ordinary. But what was strange is as time went on, she, his wife, started to hear from Terry less and less. And that wasn't inherently weird. She figured that he was just kind of, which I'll tell you now, my marriage, I could never. But for her, she's like, well, he's just kind of doing his thing. He's doing what he needs to do. Eventually, he's going to get bored with Colorado, and he's going to call and tell me he's coming back. But that never happened. So as time went on and this wasn't happening and he wasn't communicating with her, she started to get irritated, which, yes, girl, same. Imagine, put yourself in that situation. You're a woman, you're married, your husband decides to just leave for an extended period of time and doesn't communicate with you like at all. I would be pissed. And guess what? She was too. She started to have different ideas going through her head of what might have been going on. And one of the things that went through her brain is that maybe he had met another woman in Colorado who was soaking up all of his attention, right? So she decides to try to get his attention. She's going to file for divorce. Now, color her surprised when this didn't work. He didn't reach out to her. He didn't respond to her. Eventually, time went by and the divorce just went through. So she figured that it was over. And eventually she moved out of the home that her and Terry shared, and she just figured that it was done, so she gave up. But what's sad here is what she didn't know is that Terry wasn't not communicating with her because he didn't want to. It's because he couldn't. He had disappeared. Like I said earlier, one day Lori came home from work and she found that Terry was just gone. Like his clothes and his tools were still at the house, but his truck, and his dogs were gone. And to this day, nobody knows what happened to those dogs. When Lori asked Scott, like, what happened to Terry, he said just what I said before, that he had won the lottery, ran off with some woman, never to be seen again. And because that explanation was believed, and because, his wife had divorced him, nobody knew he was missing, and nobody reported him missing. Now, the only time that I know that anybody heard from Terry, by the way, after he went missing, was about a year after he went missing, when his brother, Scott's father, actually received an email. The email, like the name of the email seemed like it was, in fact, Terry, and he was emailing saying that he was just having a great time in Mexico and that he probably was never going to come back, which, I guess some people do that with their lives. Live your life if that's what he was doing, but spoiler alert, it was not, because police were later able to link this email to Scott. Okay, Scott made this email, Scott sent this email, and during this time, he also pretended to be his uncle, used his credit cards, stole a bunch of money writing bad checks, and took like $20,000 from his accounts. But anyways, going back to what we were talking about when we started this case, which was Lori and Rob and Bob. Once the two fathers heard from Lori that this man, Terry Kimball, was also missing, they knew they needed to go to the FBI. So they did just that. They went to the Denver office and they told the new supervisor there everything they had to say, everything about their new suspicions, everything they thought was going on. They connected all these dots. And they ended this conversation with telling this new supervisor, quote, "You guys have a choice. You could be the hero or the zero. You can either look into it or you can be the zero and ignore it," which is very dramatic and makes me think of Hercules, but it was effective. It seemed at this time they were actually going to be looking into the disappearances more seriously. Meanwhile, if you recall, Scott was in jail. He had been arrested for that check fraud case. So I guess what happened there is the guy he was stealing money from was an optometrist who had an office in the same building where Scott's mother, Barb, had an office because she did something in insurance. So both of these people have offices in the same building, and she had actually given an office space to Scott in the basement. There was a little space set up for him. And there was also a meat freezer for him to keep his beef, because remember, he has a farm. He does something with beef. And down there was a closet where the optometrist kept all of his financial records, papers, things like that. So that's how he got access. But anyways, he was arrested, and Detective Thatcher was looking into him for both the check fraud thing, they're making that case, and he was already looking into him for Kaysi's disappearance, because if you recall from part 1, he goes to the farm, talks to Lori about the check fraud thing, finds out Scott's gone, and that he may be related to her missing daughter's case. So with all of this coming together, him talking to Lori, and then the fathers coming in and saying that they believe this was the case, and there's now another missing girl linked to him, the police officer is believing, Thatcher's believing that, it seems like this is probably something, right? If there is smoke, there is fire. So he tells them, he's like, I will do everything in my power to figure out what happened to these girls. And he starts looking into him. He's like, I'm going to look into Scott and figure out everything I can. Because at this point, there are 2 missing girls linked to him and his uncle. They don't even know about LeAnn yet. All of it is just looking weird. So in the fall of 2006, just weeks after the fathers met with the FBI and told them about their suspicions, the fathers, Rob and Bob, a new FBI agent is actually put on the case with Thatcher to start looking into Scott Kimball. And this was officer or agent detective Jonathan Grusing, Grusing. So this new guy, Grusing, and the guy who had initially been working on the check fraud thing, Thatcher, they start working together. They become a little team to look into Scott Kimball. And they call their project Operation Snowball, probably because they had started looking into this check fraud thing and it freaking snowballed into multiple missing persons cases right before their eyes. You know what I mean? So basically their goal is to try to speak to Scott and try to see just how much information they can get out of him about the disappearances specifically, because right now he's just in jail for the check fraud thing, and all they have about the missing people, in reference to the missing people, all they have is people's words, right? Because they haven't looked into it fully at this point. So these men start tag teaming him in the questioning way, of course, and they're getting a lot of information. Okay, he is quite the yapper, like some of you in the comments say that I am. I see them. I ignore them. But anyways, they are talking to him and he is telling them everything. And they're like, I don't know how much of this I can believe, what can be proven or disproven, because there was so much information. He just loves to tell stories, and they know that all of these stories aren't true. And that's the problem, because he also told police the story about his Uncle Terry winning the lottery and running off to Mexico with some woman. And they knew that this wasn't true because they had already looked into this. They had looked into the Ohio lottery and found that they never paid out Terry. Like, Terry was never a lottery winner. So it showed them right there that not everything he was saying was true, which duh, but that's what they said. Now, what these officers actually believe happened to Terry Kimball, or why Scott had murdered his uncle, had to do with something, again, tale as old as time. And it was money, because apparently Terry Kimball didn't believe in banks. Like, that wasn't a thing for him. Apparently, because he kept a suitcase full of thousands of dollars just with him. And something that they learned very quickly in looking into Scott is he was a very money-motivated person. And Grusing, the detective Grusing, said of this, quote, "If you had to pick one thing that drives Scott Kimball, what is it? Greed, most likely. And not only greed for money, but he craves attention and he craves power as well." Yeah, they believe those were his motivators. Those were his motives for murder. Now, while talking to Scott and trying to get information from him, even though he was not the most reliable narrator, right? They also started moving in a different direction, or another direction, and started talking to people who knew the women and started talking to people who knew Scott. And you know who sat perfectly in the center of that? What is it? The 3-circle graph that overlaps the Venn diagram. The person who sat perfectly in the center of the 2-circle Venn diagram was a man named Steve. This was Steve Ennis, Jennifer's prison boyfriend, because he sat in one circle, which was he knew Jennifer, and he sat in another circle in that he knew Scott because he was Scott's former cellmate. So they're linked. They're linked. So they go to Steve and they start talking to Steve. And in doing so, they learn that, yes, Scott definitely knew who Jennifer was. I guess while in prison, Steve would keep photos of Jennifer up on his wall. And I mean, I've shown photos of her. She is clearly beautiful and would have caught Scott's attention. But it wasn't just that. Steve and Scott had talked about Jennifer specifically. And Scott, who was going to get out of jail sooner than Steve, had told Steve that he believed he could help Jennifer get a job, get more work, because she wanted to get out of the dancing business. Apparently he, Scott, and Jennifer had spoken about this, and he was able to convince her that he could get her a job selling coffee from espresso carts in Seattle, and that she had the potential to earn a few $1,000s a day, which was appealing because, again, Jennifer wanted to get into a different line of work. Now, it does not appear that there ever was any job in Seattle. The police believe that this was just a big lie for Scott to get close to Jennifer, but she didn't know that it was a lie, and Steve didn't know that it was a lie, so he told her that she could trust Scott. And then, man, okay, this is so wild. Like, this whole case is wild. Okay, there are some twists and there are some turns, but in order for Scott to get close to Jennifer, because remember, he's in jail and he wants to get close to Jennifer. He wants to get out of jail so that he can do whatever it is that he wants to do. So he uses his role as a police informant, yeah, I said that right, as a police informant to leverage early release by telling his FBI people that he talks to that Jennifer was going to be involved in a murder for hire plot. This is real life. Basically, Scott tells them that there's this person, a witness, who is meant to testify in court about a meth ring, a drug ring, and that Jennifer's ex-boyfriend, who was a drug dealer who was in jail, was trying to have this witness killed, and he was going to have Jennifer help him do it. Now, this isn't true, mind you, but this is the information he's bringing to the FBI. These are the vibes he's bringing to the function. Okay, so he was released December of 2002. He was made the informant on this case that did not exist, which made it so that he could get close to Jennifer, which he did. Some reports even said that she moved in with Scott, and within just months, she vanished. And during the time that she disappeared, there was a period of 3 days where her phone was turned off and his phone was turned off, and there was absolutely no cell phone activity. Now, Scott has to explain why she disappeared or how she disappeared, right? Because he was released from jail to watch her. So he tells police that she had flown to New York to kill this witness for her boyfriend. Okay, he even said that she took $600 and bought a revolver for the job. Okay, this is supposed to explain why her car is left at the airport, but this never happened. Because remember, they had already proven that she didn't take any flights out. But anyways, back to Steve. In speaking to him, they're learning the relationship between Jennifer and Scott and how she may know them. And that is incredibly valuable. But he goes on to give them some even more valuable information. And that's when he tells police that there is another guy in prison right at that moment that they should speak to, because this man also had a girlfriend who went missing after being introduced to Scott Kimball. And this man was Stephen Hawley, LeAnn Emry's prison boyfriend. So now police know that there is yet another missing girl linked to Scott Kimball. I'm sorry, I'm getting so hot right now. I don't know if you can tell. I'm like fidgeting. It's just like crazy. But anyways, this is how they now know that there's another potential missing girl related, connected to Scott, right? They hear this, but they need to confirm it. So they actually call. They call LeAnn's family and they ask if they can speak to LeAnn. And that's when they learn that, no, sir, you cannot speak to LeAnn because she has been missing since 2003. And bro, once the detectives heard this, one of them, I think it was Grissing, said that he felt a chill go up and down his spine because he just knew in that moment this was another victim of Scott's, because nothing else made any sense. So police go to talk to Steve, and this is Stephen Hawley, not to be confused with Steve Ennis, which was Jennifer's boyfriend. They're talking to Stephen Hawley, which is LeAnn's boyfriend. And in talking to him, they learn how Scott came to know LeAnn. So basically, he admits to police, which is something that could get him in trouble, so it does seem to be very true. He admits to police that he and Scott Kimball had been scheming to escape prison and run off to Mexico. Okay? Basically, he said that him and Scott were talking and he wanted to get out. Both of them wanted to get out. And Steve specifically wanted to get out and run away with his girlfriend, LeAnn. But he was in jail. So Scott's like, hey, listen, I get in and out of jail all the time. I'm going to get out before you. I'm an informant. I can make that happen for myself. So what you should do is give me LeAnn's info. I'll go. I'll get her. We'll help you escape. And then we'll all run off to Mexico together. And remember, that's what LeAnn said she was doing, was she was going to go caving in Mexico. So in hearing this, Steve's like, oh man, everything's coming up Millhouse. Now, I'm not going to lie, it is odd to me in hearing Steven talk, like in what he thinks of Scott, that he would even allow LeAnn to meet him, though it could just be that in hindsight he's saying these things. But he did say that, like, he told police that Scott was a, quote, sick fuck who fantasized about being a serial killer, and once had even asked Steven if he would kill Scott's ex-wife, like asking him to make sure that it would be torturous and to make sure that she knew that Scott was the one who set up this hit. So in hearing this and knowing he's like this violent guy, why he would trust him to link up with LeAnn, I cannot say, but he did. So from there, Scott and LeAnn started talking. They talked for the first time on Christmas Day of 2002, and from there would sometimes talk up to 17 times a day, and had somehow formed some sort of relationship or like civil friendship, something going on there, because she trusted him. She trusted that he would help her end up being able to live the life she wanted in Mexico with her boyfriend. At least that's what Scott says. And even though this was what Scott said, it did seem to check with a lot of things. One, it was similar to what Steve was saying happened. And two, we know she was with somebody between the time that she went missing and when her car was found abandoned, right? She was out there. She was writing those bad checks and taking money from her father's account. And we do know that she did know Scott. It wasn't just the words of people saying she did. She did know Scott. During their investigation, they were able to confirm this because they took some items from Scott's home when they did searches. And one of these things was his laptop. On Scott's laptop, they found a photo of LeAnn. Well, they found multiple photos of LeAnn. And in these photos, she had cut her hair short and dyed it dark, just like the person at the hotel remembered seeing her. Remember, they remembered seeing her like that? And she didn't do this to her hair until after she went missing. And though there were several photos of LeAnn on this computer, her family has never seen them. Apparently, the photos were not great, and what was happening to her was not great. Like, they've never even been told what was happening in these photos because it was bad. Okay, she was going through hell. And this is like a whole nother part of this case, because when police went through his laptop, they found that there were a lot of horrible photos of women on there, a lot of photos with bondage and with rape, and a lot of them were downloaded from the internet, but not all of them were. And on his computer, there were also photos of 4 unidentified women and also 3 of his known victims. So this guy was a monster. And even though there was evidence directly in his face, he was denying everything. He said he was not involved. He never killed anybody. He never made anybody go missing. It was just a huge coincidence that so many people linked to him had disappeared. Kaysi, LeAnn, Jennifer, Uncle Terry. It's all just a big coincidence, guys. I have no idea what happened. I know it's super weird that they disappeared, but I had nothing to do with it. And it's just weird, it's very rich rather, that he would deny everything because they found so many things linked to him. They found the photo of LeAnn on his computer. They found Kaysi's date book in a box of his things. They found the email that he had sent pretending to be Terry. They found that it was linked to him. They found his handgun. They found his rifle. And he was just like, listen, I know it's weird that you found so many things connected to these missing people, like in my stuff, but it wasn't me. I didn't kill anybody. And at this time, they didn't even have any bodies, so they couldn't prove that any of these people were dead. Yet. But they did try, okay? They searched a bone pit that was on Scott's cattle pasture and found nothing. They dug up a swimming pool that Scott had filled and found nothing. And he would give them nothing in terms of information about the murders. Well, okay, not nothing. He would tell police that he knew about the murders and had maybe even been there when the murders were committed, but that he was not the one who committed the murders. Basically, what he was telling police is that he was part of an organized crime ring. And so he knew bad people. He worked with bad people, but he himself was not a bad person, and he would never be the person to actually commit a murder. For example, he said that Jennifer had been murdered by one of Steve Ennis's associates, but claimed that he knew what happened and where she was, and even said that he had been asked to dig up Jennifer and remove her breast implants and like the physical birth control that was in her body. Which was interesting that he said this because later one of his former cellmates came forward and told police that Scott had asked him if a person could be identified by the serial number on their breast implants. And I guess this guy was taken aback and asked him, like, why are you worried about serial numbers and breast implants when there are so many other ways that one could identify a body, like fingerprints, footprints, teeth, like the head? And he said that Scott responded by saying that you could cut off the hands, the feet, and the head, and that nobody could identify them. So all of this was making it sound like Scott was definitely involved. They just needed to prove it. So they continued pushing forward. Okay, they continued looking into the case. They continued speaking to Scott. And eventually in April of 2008, they finally got their first real lead. And that's when Scott kind of slipped up in giving some information. He said that maybe, just maybe, it was possible that Kaysi had died of a drug overdose in like a national forest. And this might seem very random, but when he said this, this immediately piqued the investigators' little, their spidey senses were a-tingling. It piqued their interest because of something they had found when they had previously searched Scott's property. And basically what this was is they had found a receipt from the day that the day after Kaysi disappeared, where Scott had apparently bought pasta, meat, and lighter fluid from a grocery store in a place called Walden. And Walden was surrounded by Root National Forest. Which, man, for this cop, I believe it was gruesome to put this together. Bravo, sir. Like, do you, in fact, wake up in the morning in piss excellence? Because it seems like perhaps you do. Now, I do wonder, did Scott mean to give so much away? Like, was it an accident? Did he want to get caught? Or did he really just think that he was so much smarter than them that they'd never put it together? I can't say, but here we find ourselves. Anyways, moving forward, with this information they got from Scott, they call and they speak to Park Services or whatever. And this is when they get some huge news. They learn that the winter before, a skull and leg bones had been found in the area by a hunter. Just a casual skull and leg bones laying there for somebody to stumble upon. I guess this hunter who had been out there had seen something and thought it was like an elk skull or an elk bone, something related to elk, okay? But as he got closer, he could see very clearly what he had stumbled upon. And he said he believed that it was divine intervention that helped him find these bones. And he said specifically of this quote, "If I hadn't been at that exact spot at that time of the morning with the sun glinting off the skull, I would not have seen it. Something happened. Somebody wanted me to find it." Now, the day that the hunter found these bones, he knew that snow was on the horizon, right? It's winter. He knew it was going to snow. So he tied like a ribbon or something to the tree to mark the spot where the bones were found, picked up the skull and took him with it to continue his day as normal as one can. Like he said, finish the day as normal as possible, as normal as one possibly can with a skull in tow. And the next day he dialed 911. Now, in learning all of this, the detectives, of course, went and retrieved the bones and immediately ran DNA tests on what was left. And they were actually able to get something, which is surprising because we do see in so many cases where that's difficult. But man, forensics are advancing more and more every day. So once they got the DNA back, they were able to finally answer a question. 4 years after Kaysi went missing, they were able to tell her family what had happened to her, which was both comforting and also horrifying, because in learning this let Lori know that Scott Kimball, her husband, had murdered her daughter. He killed her daughter, and then she married him and honeymooned in a location that was near where her body would be found. I can't imagine. She was literally sleeping with the enemy, and she said of this quote, "It's impossible to describe knowing you've married your daughter's murderer." Now, this was a huge step, of course, because they finally had something physical that linked Scott to these disappearances and murders. But the problem was, though it was compelling, it was very compelling. I mean, a receipt being found that showed that this guy was at a location at the same time when somebody went missing, and then her body was found in that location. That's huge. But it wasn't enough for the prosecutors to feel like they had enough to go to trial yet. It's unfortunate because they knew he needed to be, right? They knew he was a danger to the community and he needed to be behind bars for a long time. And he would be. Because remember, he had other charges he was in jail on. And in December of 2008, he was sentenced to those charges related to the finances and all that, not related to the murders. And dude, he got 48 years for these crimes. And now, you know, he didn't have his police informant buddies to back him up because he's being looked at for murders. Now, they could stop here, right? I mean, at his age, the 48-year sentence is basically a life sentence, but they decided that they weren't going to just stop there, right? They wanted to give the families closure, and they also wanted to mark this guy as the violent piece of shit that he was. But the problem was they didn't have any information, they didn't have any bodies, and they didn't have any leads. So they decided to go to Scott Kimball with a deal. Basically, they told him that if they were to try to go after him for these murders, and he was to get convicted of first-degree murder, he would be in jail, life in prison, no possibility of parole. But what they were offering him would give him significantly less time. Basically, they were like, listen, if you can lead us and help us retrieve the bodies of LeAnn, of Jennifer, and of Terry, we will make it so that you can plead guilty to just one count of second-degree murder. Now, Scott must have known that his goose was effectively cooked because he was like, okay, I'll take the deal and I'll lead you to the bodies. And man, that must have been the best moment because he finally was admitting, right? He had been denying. You know, he's like, I'll lead you to the bodies, which showed that he knew where they were because he was involved. Now, this gave the families very mixed feelings, like this plea deal, obviously, because like LeAnn's family, for example, they wanted him to have life in prison without parole. That's what they wanted for him. But what they thought was most important was that he was in jail for a very long time because they truly believed if he was ever free, he would kill again. They also added that not that it doesn't matter, but that they'll never really get closure anyway. There will always be a scar there no matter what. Like there will be a scar because they lost their daughter, and some justice is better than no justice. So with that, they went out looking for the bodies. And of course, it would take a while. They were flying planes over the canyon and getting satellite imagery. As each day passed, nothing was found, which had to be discouraging. But then one day, Agent Grusing found some bones near a large rock. When he lifted the rock, he saw that there was a hair clip with some hair still attached, and immediately knew that these were the remains of LeAnn Emry. Next to her remains, they also found a spent bullet, like a bullet casing from Scott's gun, and they believed that Scott marched her up there to execute her. What they put together is that LeAnn had helped Scott launder some money. Like that's what she was doing with him during that, like several days, like almost 2 weeks that she was missing, and that once she had served her purpose, he was just done with her. So he took her up there and he killed her. That's what police believe. She was just that disposable to him. And that's also what I mean when I say his motives are just so different than we typically see with serial killers. And as far as her family goes, they accept that she had wound up being connected to some bad people. And she doesn't know how involved she was with the bad things that they were doing, but they do say, and they know deep in their hearts, that she didn't deserve this, right? No matter how involved she was, she didn't deserve this. The baby that they loved and took care of and watched grow did not deserve to die this way. And it's just so sad because her family did get to see where her body was found. Like after the body was recovered, they went up there and they had plans to go up there after the fact because they wanted to like place a granite stone, basically a headstone for her there with her birth dates and her death dates and the words, quote, forever loved, never forgotten. They said that even though she wasn't there anymore, right? Like that's not where she was buried anymore. They still wanted to turn her crime scene into a place of remembrance for her. And as far as her actual remains, they were planning to cremate her. I believe this is what they did, to cremate her and then take some of her ashes to a burial place in Wyoming so that she could be buried next to her Dalmatian Shadow, because she always said that she wanted to be buried next to Shadow. After finding LeAnn's remains, they continued to search. And after a while, they also found the partially mummified remains of Terry. His body was found about 100 miles from where he was last seen. And that was the home that he had shared with Lori and Scott. So now with LeAnn and Terry found, the only person they had left to uncover was Jennifer. But each time they went out and searched, they came back empty-handed. They searched with Scott, with him showing them where to look. They searched with dogs. They even searched with a geologist. But each time, they were unable to find anything. And police actually believe in this case, it was intentional. They think that Scott had an emotional attachment to Jennifer specifically, and that's why he is not revealing where she is. Whether it being that he wants to be the only person who knows where her body is, or that maybe something more horrible happened to her that he doesn't want people to know. But Scott says that's not this case. Scott says that he is taking them to where he remembers her being, right? He's like, I'm taking you to where I took her, but I was only there once and it was after dark. So I'm doing the best I can here. And he also said that he was willing to take a polygraph test to prove that the directions he was giving them were true to his knowledge. But police were not buying it. And Agent Grusing said that Scott was, quote, very methodical and that there was zero chance that he didn't remember exactly where he put Jennifer. But he's never told the exact location of where her body was. So to this day, sadly, her body has never been recovered. And they just had the 20th anniversary of her disappearance last year, and she's still gone. Now, because Jennifer's body was never recovered, that means that technically Scott did not follow through on his part of the deal. So the terms were renegotiated. So before he was going to be pleading guilty to 1 count of second-degree murder, which if I read correctly, I don't believe he was going to get any additional time for that, which is absolutely wild. But because he did not find Jennifer's body, great movie, but because he didn't find Jennifer's body, my brain, Jesus, let me backtrack. Okay. Because he did not find Jennifer's body, his terms were renegotiated, and now he was going to be pleading guilty to all 4 counts of second-degree murder. And during this hearing, the families were finally able to speak directly to Scott Kimball, which had to have been so wild because this is something that for the longest time it didn't seem like was going to happen. You know, the cases weren't even looked into. So if these fathers hadn't put 2 and 2 together and pushed the police, they may never have even been here. All 3 fathers of the murdered women spoke directly to Scott. Kaysi's father said to him, quote, Kaysi McLeod was my firstborn daughter. I was present right there, the very first moment she took her first breath. Scott Kimball was there to take her last. That's powerful, man. So Jennifer Marcum's father also spoke to Scott where he said, quote, Scott Kimball has destroyed our lives. Our lives will never be the same. How many other people are missing as a result of his life? Now, that is something we are going to be discussing in a little bit, so put a pin in that because police do believe that he is linked to other murders. But back to the fathers. LeAnn's father also spoke to Scott, or rather about Scott, when he said, quote, my daughter was a young woman with feelings and dreams, and to treat her like trash is despicable. He's a liar, a deceiver, and a murderer. So for these murders, Scott Kimball was subsequently given 70 years in prison. And he swears to this day up and down that, well, not to this day, we'll get there too. But at the time he swore up and down that he was not a serial killer. He said he was just a guy. He wasn't cold-blooded. He wasn't calculated in that way. And anybody who knew him that you talked to would say the same. And after he was sentenced, his cousin gave a statement on his behalf where he said, quote, I, Scott Lee Kimball, have pleaded guilty to counts of murder in the second degree. This was part of a plea bargain arrangement. I am sorry for my crimes. I accept full responsibility for my role in these murders. I deserve to be held accountable and punished for my crimes. However, I did not act alone. Now, during this time, Lori, who was Kaysi's mom and Scott's ex-wife, was there, and she spoke to the cousin, and she's like, okay, make this make sense for me. If there were other people involved here, then why does Scott need to marry me and murder my daughter? Like, how does that make sense? Because the math doesn't seem to be mathing here. And the cousin just responded by saying that Scott has claimed he is in an organized crime group. And her response was like, yeah, okay, well, that's just stupid, which... Say it louder for those in the back. You remember who else said some stupid shit like that? Dumbass Wade Wilson. The whole crime ring thing is always so dumb for me. And not that it's never true, but in these two cases, they were dumb. And we are going to talk about the whole crime ring a little bit later in this video. We're almost done, but we're going to talk about it in just a second. But I felt just about his cousin, man, I felt so bad for him because you could tell that, like, he's not sure how he feels and he's not sure if he believes Scott, at least at that time. And he just tells Lori, like, listen, this is his statement, not mine. Now, since his arrest, Scott Kimball has given interviews, and in these interviews, he says that he is not a serial killer. He says that people saying that is just people being sensational. He says if you ask around to people who knew him, you would know that he's not a violent guy. He's not a guy with a temper. He's not a guy who hurts animals. He also said that nobody in his life ever needed to be afraid of him unless they screwed him over. And he said if he was released, nobody needed to worry that he'd be a danger because now he's retired. He said he doesn't work with the groups and agencies that he used to work with, so everybody is safe. And when asked if he thought he would ever kill again, he said he didn't think he would. Not no, he didn't think he would. Okay, feels good. Yeah, I feel safe. Now, Scott did admit to killing his uncle Terry, but he said when it came to Kaysi, LeAnn, and Jennifer, he was just part of the mechanism. Okay. And I remember when I didn't speak to anybody. I remember when the interview was speaking to him, Scott was like, the mechanism could be many different things. And the interviewer was like, well, the mechanism could be the person who pulls the trigger. Nope. And Scott was like, yeah, it could be that. It could also be the person who arranged the murder. It could be many different things. He says that there are just so many people involved, but that he will never tell. He will never give the names of anybody because he is not a snitch, despite the fact that his name was Joe Snitch. And the police say that, yeah, of course he's not going to say who any of these other people were because these other people don't exist. Grusing says that he believes that the killing of the women was different, and that's why Scott wants to separate himself from them. That there was more to it, an emotional attachment and also a sexual attachment, and that's why he doesn't want to relate himself to that. It's much easier for him to admit to killing Terry because for Terry, it was all money motivated. But with the women, there was more to it than that. According to investigators who have interviewed Scott, he is very manipulative. He's the type of person who can draw people in and make them believe that by knowing him, great things are going to happen to them. But instead, they end up dead. Grusing said that Scott is very good at paying attention, reading people, and figuring out what they like and what they don't so he can appeal to them. And he says that Scott preys on their ability to trust. They also said that he's very calculated and intelligent, some even calling him a psychopath or the devil. And Scott has commented on this a little bit. He says that he agrees that he was very smart and could have done anything with his life, but that he chose this. And what he's talking about when he says he chose this, he's talking about being a con man. And he says that he was so successful at this for so many years because of his extreme preparation. And his extreme preparation is exactly what police think he used in order to kill and successfully hide his victims' bodies, because it was clear he had taken great lengths to make sure they would never be found. But they were found, and that was due in great part by the pushing of these girls' parents. And I think that that is an amazing thing. Man, if it wasn't for them, they never would have gotten in contact with the right police officer who took them seriously. And apparently the FBI has been very apologetic. They've said over and over how sorry they are for not taking them seriously in the beginning. They said that Scott fooled them. They straight up said, like, Scott fooled them. Scott fooled everyone. But, apologies only go so far because these women are still gone. And if Scott had been monitored more closely when he was released by authorities, then they wouldn't be. I mean, he was literally released to watch Jennifer, and she disappeared. Now, the man in charge of the Denver FBI office has given a statement about this and was like, listen, we can't watch informants 24/7. He was like, listen, we can't control them. We don't have the authority or even the resources to do so. And he said specifically, quote, "This case is a tragedy. It's a tragedy for the victims. It's a tragedy for the victims' families. But to be clear, the individual responsible for that is Scott Kimball. It's not the FBI. It's not anybody else. It's him. He did it. Which you let me know what you think about that, because of course Scott is responsible for the murders, but he was only able to do that because they let him out, and he used that freedom to murder people. So does the blame only go on him, or does it also go on the people who made it possible for him to be free to commit them? That's the question. Just like Jesse McFadden. These are the questions. Now, it took some time, but Scott Kimball has finally admitted what he did to Kaysi, LeAnn, and Jennifer, which is something, right? It brings the family something. Not closure, because closure doesn't really exist, but at least answers. And I mean, answers are all they have. You know, they don't have their kids, and their kid's murderer is this background noise in their lives. They don't get the opportunity to feel normal or to have happiness, because all they have are these memories of a child they'll never see again. They didn't get to see their kids finish life, you know, to grow old, to go on to have careers if that's what they wanted. And for two of these women, they never got to go on and have children if that's what they would have wanted. And for Jennifer's boys, they never got to have their mother in their lives as they grew up. And she's still gone, and that's so horrible, because there's a chance that she'll never be found. And that's incredibly difficult for her family to reckon with. But they say that the way that they deal with it is just knowing that she is in heaven. So, the confession. In 2011, Scott Kimball sent a letter that had, wait for it, 147 pages worth of information. And this was sent to someone in his family, but it ended up in the hands of the FBI. And in this letter, he admitted what he did to these women. So we will start with Kaysi here. He said when it came to Kaysi, her death was not on purpose. Her death was an accident, which I will say, in hearing what he did, I don't know if I believe that, but what he said he did is he was with her, and he gave her a combination of alcohol, meth, and Oxycontin, or oxycodone, one of the oxys of the many oxys, and that she OD'd, and that he wasn't trying to kill her, but he did dispose of her body. He said when it came to Jennifer, he had prepared for her a hot shot, which if you're like me and you had no idea what that is, basically he made it so that she would die by ODing on heroin. And when it came to LeAnn, this was the most violent, I don't know, it seems like a drug overdose would be very violent, but the most outwardly violent confession, when he said that he shot her twice in the back of the neck when she tried to escape him. Now why? Why did he decide to tell the truth now? Well, according to his cousin, he has, like we so often see, he's become religious in jail. Okay, he told the truth because he is God-fearing now, and he's worried that if he doesn't confess before he dies, he won't get to go to heaven. Now, it is believed that there is some truth to the confessions that Scott gave, but the problem with him is that he is believed to either be a psychopath or a sociopath who actually has gotten to a point where he believes his lies. So though there is some truth in his confessions, they are ultimately incomplete. Grusing has said he believes he will be unraveling this case of Scott Kimball for his entire career. And he says that it's a very odd experience because when he talks to him, oftentimes he finds him to be pleasant to talk to. He's charming and he's intelligent and he's like a friendly guy to chat with. And I find that personally to be very scary. But they continue to talk to him because they want to get more information out of him because they believe he's responsible for other murders, and they want to link him to these other unsolved cases, but so far, they've been unsuccessful. One victim that they tried to link to Scott was the Maiden Water victim, whose body was discovered in Utah in 1998. At the time they were looking into Scott, she had no name, but she has since been identified as Lena Reyes Geddes, and though the police did suspect Scott could be involved, her case has since been closed, with her husband, Edward Geddes, eventually being named her killer, but he actually died by suicide in 2001, so there was never any real justice there. The next victim that they have tentatively linked to Scott was a woman named Katrina Powell. She was 26 years old, and she was found murdered in Denver in, I believe it was 2004, and this case is horrible. In October of 2004, the naked body of a young woman was found near a dumpster at a Westminster strip mall, and her hands had been cut off, which I personally found to be notable considering what the cellmate said that Scott said about removing identifying features to not have the person identified. But Scott would not be the first person to cut off hands. I just found that to be noteworthy. But anyways, once they did an autopsy on this woman, they realized that she had been brutalized. They said that by saying she had a horrible death, that would be a complete understatement. she had been sexually tortured and mutilated, and the killer had used chemicals that were so strong that they burned her skin when they were used to get rid of evidence. And she was said to have been horribly beaten and then strangled before her hands were removed. Now, I guess in the early days of this investigation, she was listed as Jane Doe because nobody knew who she was because she was missing her hands. But a composite sketch was made, and her sister-in-law ended up seeing this composite sketch. The same sister-in-law who later raised money to get her a gravestone and wanted to get a gravestone of 2 praying hands because those were the items that her killer had stolen from her. Now, the reason Scott specifically was looked into when it came to Katrina's death is because Katrina lived the same sort of vulnerable lifestyle that many of Scott's, victims did, because Scott Kimball lived in the area at the time that this happened, and because reportedly he admitted to committing this murder to a prison cellmate at some point while he was in jail, though he has never admitted it to police. Now, it has also been reported that police believe that it's possible that Scott Kimball could also be responsible for the murders that were committed by the West Mesa bone collector, which, if you are unfamiliar, I wasn't actually super familiar either, but apparently 11 women's remains were found buried in 2009 in the desert on the West Mesa of Albuquerque, New Mexico, and police think it's possible that Scott Kimball was involved. He was out of jail working as an informant when this happened and was rearrested in 2006. And when he was rearrested, those murders stopped. Those disappearances stopped. Now, Scott does deny being involved in these murders. He wrote a letter to his cousin where he just said, no, I'm not responsible for any of the killings in New Mexico. And he says he believes that he's been connected to this because he would oftentimes drive through that area while delivering meat heading to California. So at this point, we just don't know. Apparently, police are looking at him for up to 24 additional murders, but they say that it's very difficult to pin down who he may have been responsible for killing because of the victim type he chose. He was the type of person who preyed on the most vulnerable people, right? Everybody he surrounded himself with had some sort of problem. So it's hard to know everybody that he could be responsible for hurting. But they do believe that he has killed additional people because they're like, listen, I find it very unlikely that we just happen to stumble upon every single person that he was responsible for killing. They just don't think that's possible because there are so many years of his life that are unaccounted for, and they don't believe he'd go from 0 to 60 just like that. And to me, that does check. It does seem very unlikely that they would be able to figure out every single person that he had made disappear, because what about people out there who didn't have anybody looking for them? Based on Scott's history, it does seem that he would be privy to individuals in that exact situation. So for now, they investigate and he sits in jail, which has been mostly uneventful, but not totally uneventful, because he did end up getting additional charges for trying to escape prison. And he had tried to escape prison by helicopter, which is quite the dramatic way to try to escape prison, but he was caught and he was given additional charges for the escape attempt and also for trying to solicitate a murder while in prison. Which, when I hear that, all I wonder is, Scott, where is your new fear of God now? Because you are still committing crimes and trying to kill people. But for these crimes, he was given, I believe, an additional 4 years and now still sits in jail. He was in Colorado, but I believe he was transferred to Florida in 2021, though I'm not sure why. And last I read, he was in a high security prison in Coleman, and he is set to be released in January of 2082. But I can't see a reality where he lives that long, so he will likely die behind bars where he belongs. And with that, my friends, is the story of the murders of Scott Kimball. I hope that you found my telling to be informative. I hope I gave you all the information you would want when looking into this case. 2 videos worth of information, I think, is a whole lot. And of course, I just want to thank you for hanging out and remembering Kaysi, LeAnn, Jennifer, and Terry with me today. Now, considering everything I told you throughout this video, I now want to revisit the questions of the day, and these are them. 1, do you think there are more victims that are linked to Scott Kimball, or do you think they uncovered all there is to uncover? And 2, do you think there's any truth to the organized crime ring allegation, or, whatever he's saying? Do you think that there's any truth to that? Let me know all your thoughts in the comments below, because I'm curious to see what you think, even if you disagree with me. Anyways, guys, please don't forget to leave me a comment down below with whatever case you'd like to see me cover in the future. As you know, I have a long list of cases, and whenever you leave me a suggestion, I put it on my list with your name next to it, so if I cover it, I can give you a shout out. I love looking into the cases you guys suggest because they're often cases I haven't heard of or cases that need more coverage, and I know you're filled with great ideas and great taste, otherwise you would not be here. If you haven't already, please don't forget to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing the bell. I put out a new video every single week, sometimes 2 a week, and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you, specifically you, but I can only do that if you join the Brat Pack and become one of us. One of us. One of us. One of us. And if you want to hang out more consistently, all my social media is listed down below, along with a link to my membership and a link to my merch store. And now with all that said, I just want to thank you for being here when you could literally be anywhere else in the world. That is tight. You are tight. Please stay safe and be a better person than you were yesterday, and I hope to see you in my next video.